classify them in one of the gait faces, but we know that there will be on one side they are more prone to loading and the other to propulsing, right? And
Yeah, I like
even if they are in a, I don't know, you know what I mean?
Maybe. So I think the right side I like to call more heel strike-ish. Left side's more toe off. So I think relative to who they are as a human, you're going to see, like, for example, if a wide is biased towards more mid stance, it's going to be a little bit different, right? So you'd expect to see a wide to have lower arches, but you're still going to see a little bit lower one on the left most times. Narrows have high arches, same thing.
Okay. If someone else has more questions, I can keep going.
These are good questions. I'm sure many people have the same ones. So,
will we see more stuff about the how to assess the ISA, because we just saw the Harman video?
So that's kind of how I do it. I know guys like Alex Effer will have them raise their arms way up and then you measure it from there, and it can vary, but ultimately I think with the ISA, you kind of find your way to do it, and like having a general overview. If you guys would like, we can do it. But it's kind of hard because we don't have other people to work on. You know,
and how do you do it online? Because
how do I do it online? So what I'll do online is I will have people do it two different ways. Generally, I will have them say, this is the exact words I use it because I've done this so many times. It's just like people really struggle with this for some reason. So I'll say, okay, I want you to bring your fingers together like this. Now, the most important part here is I want you to keep your fingers straight from your knuckle up. This cannot break. And then what I want you to do is dig up until you find your xiphoid process. And then what I want you to do is I want you to spread apart, keeping your fingers straight until you find those bottom ribs right here. This is my ISA right here. I'm very wide. And I'll generally have them do this laying down, because when you're standing up, things tend to not line up as much as they usually do. They're more accurate when you're on the ground in supine. And also, this is not the most accurate way to do it, but oftentimes I have no choice. And then usually through like a shirtless posture picture, you can also kind of tell what's going on within their infrasternal angle as well, assuming that they have like a relatively decently, like, you know, not a crazy amount of body fat.
Perfect, thank you.
And there's also something to be said for not even taking the ISA online if people can't do it, because some people will just really, really struggle. And honestly, like, I've gotten to the point with some people where it's like, okay, I'm just not even going to take it. And I'm just going to fill in the gaps and see what turns up. And, you know, you can kind of go from there, because you kind of get an idea of what someone is. And if you're unsure, just filling in the movement options and then kind of like going from there and seeing how they react to it will tell you a lot as well.
And in the left AIC, apart from the rotation, there is also hike on the right side, right? So how do we address that? Because we are working on the adductors here, ABD here, but how is this gonna change?
So with this orientation right here, this right here, what's going to change this is being able to push out of the right and accept that weight on our left, especially through the left obliques, because that's what's going. If you push out of the right and your left can accept that load, that's how you get it. Now, if you guys read the short right leg syndrome, that's another thing that's very common. You see that all the time. And there was someone asked the question, well, is that a left AIC? It's a progression from a left AIC in many cases. If you see a left side that's hiked up like this, and we'll get into this. So I'm trying not to confuse you guys too much right now.
Sorry.
But, no, this is a great question. So this is an attempt to find internal rotation on the right. This right here is because the right side does not have IR. So if you see someone walk and they hike up their left side, it's because usually they don't have internal rotation. Same thing for the left side. So when you see this, you know that this individual is trying to find right IR. So their pelvis goes on an oblique axis. Now, I have a powerlifting client right now when he bench presses like this. Like his left side is higher than his right. And he has this like awkward amount of right flexion in his wrist. And he can't really supinate the left. It's this weird orientation, but the guy measures as a left AIC. So it's really bizarre because we brought him back to what should be a left AIC, but what was really going on is he has this oblique orientation in his pelvis, like this, where he's hiked up on the left. So what ends up happening, like this is a normal bench press, right? I should be able to do this. But if I'm here, because my pelvis hikes up like this and is on this oblique orientation, because I'm trying to find right side internal rotation, then this happens. And that's where he is. So PRI is, I'm trying to, I don't know what the line is for like going too deep on this, but PRI is really, really big about the left hamstring for a reason, in my opinion, because I think they're aware that this happens. I think PRI is pretty smart. So what they do is they really emphasize this left hamstring, because regardless of if you are here or here, this left hamstring still needs to work to pull it down. And this left hamstring still needs to work to allow you to push off of the right and accept the weight in your left.
That's what confused me, because if left is lower than right, why are we using the hamstring to pull it even lower?
It's because it's responsible for helping you get in single leg stance on the left. That's pretty much why.
So I have one last question. That's the last one.
Mm-hmm.
When watching FIT, what do you take as reference? Because we were analyzing ourselves the other day, and there's one guy who you can see from behind that he has an everted hind foot, but he had an inverted or supinated midfoot.
Okay, I got my foot model right here. Can you say that one more time?
So you could see a pronated foot from the back, but actually the midfoot was supinated. So he was like both things.
He was like this.
Yeah.
So what were his toes doing?
This guy, it's me.
Yeah, exactly. That's him.
He was what? I didn't hear that.
No, that's the guy.
Me.
Gilles.
It's my case.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Do your toes flare out to the side?
Hi.
Do your toes do this? Do they come outwards? Do they flare out like that?
Yes, they do.
They do? So I would call that, and it'd be kind of cool if you guys have a picture at all.
Yes.
That would be really cool if you could share it in the chat so everyone can see. Because we can use this to talk about what we said with the foot stuff in the slides. I think that'd be a cool case study.
I have a question. Is it okay if I
Yeah,
ask?
while they pull that up, why don't you ask your question?
Okay. Like through the years of teaching, I've noticed when in training, when and especially with bare feet, going into single leg stance, seeing a good amount of toe clawing. And I'm not sure if it's them trying to find external rotation, because like their big toes trying to come in, or when that's just something that I have observed and didn't know if it had anything to do with a lack of external rotation.
I think there can be a couple of different reasons for toe clawing, but generally speaking, toe clawing is an attempt to find the ground. So when someone is very unstable within their foot, their toes will claw in an attempt for their brain to find the floor, for really lack of a better term. So I see that a lot with people that are really, really far forward. So their toes are trying to claw back to keep them from falling too far forward because they're very unstable. Mm-hmm. And that also sometimes helps them form like this awkward looking arch. So when I see toes that are forward, that's an indication. I want to know what the toes are doing while they're clawing the ground. But usually if you get them to come back within their foot, they're going to let go a little bit. But you can also have an instance when they're falling too far back, so they claw the ground in order to bring their center of mass forward. It just depends on like what the rest of the leg is doing and how the pelvis presents. But I usually see it because it's too far forward and they're trying to claw.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question, if you don't mind.
Please.
Okay, cool. So this is just like I'm seeing like, I don't know if it's like confirmation bias, but I'm seeing this people getting out of their left side everywhere, almost like with every one of my clients, and it's quite interesting. But the one thing I noticed with me specifically is it feels like my left femur doesn't sit inside of the acetabulum the way as fluid as it does on my right. And I'm wondering, like, on the pelvic model, what that kind of looks like. I've been trying to visualize it in my head, but I really can't I can't seem to figure it out. Like, if I do the straight leg test, my right leg's much better than my left. Yeah. So I don't know if that's like enough information for you to be able to show me what might be going on based on what you see with other people. But yeah, that's just something that I'm trying to figure out with my own practice.
Yeah. So the right side is in relative amounts of what I call compression, and then the left side expansion, right? So the right side has a bias towards internal rotation, adduction, and extension. So the straight leg raise, because of the screw home mechanism, which we would talk about, when you straighten out your leg, your femur goes into IR and your tibia goes into relative ER. And then when you're here, your right side can do that because it's more biased towards that. You know what I mean? So it's just easier that's why I expect to see a better straight leg raise on the right than the left a lot of times. The left has to overcome its starting orientation within this expansion quality. So then it has to then go and overcome that. And then the femur needs to be able to internally rotate and go from there. But it struggles to do that because of its starting asymmetrical orientation, pretty much regardless of where you've compensated. Like I said, you can be a narrow left AIC dumped forward on both sides. Wide left AIC dumped forward on both sides. But this orientation underlines so many of where people are at. So like, this is just a present fact of life. So you might have compensations that are still there, but at the end of the day, your right side can still access these compressive measurements more than your left.
Okay. And then when you're talking about, like when you're building a program for somebody like that presents this, I find, like, for instance, like I do a short meditation every morning, and when I sit and cross-legged, like sometimes I'm just like, I don't know if I'm like pushing this further into kind of like the dysfunction. So I feel like for a long time I was like, oh, I just need to stretch and externally rotate my femur, but it was never getting better. So now I've been doing the like the adductor drawbacks and even just like side lying adductor stuff with my left. And then I actually, if I internally rotate my femur enough and think about extending my hip as I adduct, I can actually sometimes get it to like, it like cracks and then it feels great. So, you know, so I'm kind of confused between this like gap of like, should I, you know, would you tell someone to kind of stop doing something like whatever, like my cross-legged position that I sit in each morning for an extended period of time? Or would you just say like, do more of the adductor? Like, do you see what I mean? Like, I'm kind of curious. I'm kind of confused on like where the line is. Yeah. So I think
that's such a good question. I think that starts to get into like personalities a little bit. So I think I'm very hesitant to tell someone to change the way they do things in their life that brings them happiness. So for example, I think meditation is probably a key part of your morning and kind of like sets the tone for your day, so to speak. So if I were to tell someone, I'm not saying to you, just talking about anyone, I want you to just change the way you do this. I think some people would be hesitant to that because they're like in a pattern that allows them to do that. So I would probably just say like, I would tell the person probably experiment with both. And I would probably lean towards telling them to maybe do one of those adductor drawbacks after they do a sit or something like that.
Okay. Yeah. Like personally, I switched to the just changing positions to work on expansion into different parts of my rib cage. I figured that was probably like an efficient way to adjust and get the same benefit. But okay. Yeah. I was curious about that.
Yeah.
And will it ever go away? Like when I say go away, will it ever, like, how do you measure when it gets to the point where, you know, it's like, okay, cool. Like now I can sit in this cross-legged position, or I can start to add more external rotation to my left hip, and I know it's safe because it's like that's kind of where I'm at. Like I'm a little bit confused with my own programming.
Yeah, I think if it's not causing you pain, I don't really think it's an issue. But I think also I would use my assessments and also the perception of discomfort to know if you're there yet. So if I assess you and I know that you have a quote unquote neutral orientation of your pelvis, like you've got full hip extension, you can access flexion, ER, IR, then I'm like, okay, yeah, do whatever you want because you got it. But also I think, just sitting in a variety of different positions and just expressing that movement throughout the day is going to be really important as well. So like if you're going to sit in that position for 30 minutes every morning, maybe sit in a different position for, I don't know, X amount of time throughout the day. I think that stuff can go just as far as, doing X amount of adductor drawbacks. You know what I mean? Just like putting your body in the positions and just sitting there, I think.
Yeah, I like that. All right, thanks.
Connor, I have a question. Before you said that the pelvis will, if we lack IR on the right side, the pelvis will shift kind of this way to get that to compensate. So basically what it's doing is creating relative IR because I can't actually get actual IR. So in PRI, we focus on the left hamstring to, and this again, I've done PRI, but I don't understand it honestly. But I'm getting there. So like we want to then pull that back, right, to get the hamstring to kind of pull that pelvis back into the position that we would want. And that's kind of, I don't know, where the adductors and whole control and the whole hamstring group come into play. But then we would have to go get that IR on the right side, like after that, right? So first we are looking to get back here and then get here so that the compensation doesn't have to come back in the long run.
I think you pretty much nailed it. Yeah. I think, yeah, I mean, if you bring this from here, get them out of this position where they're trying to find IR and you get them back like this, and then you can also, while doing that, take them out of this, right side dominant pattern that was underlying it all, they're going to have right IR. So in PRI, because it's like this left AIC position, this relatively forward pelvis on the left is going to help, that hamstring is going to help pull that back so that they can find the ability to get into single leg stance on the left side and push out of the right. So really, I know it sounds crazy, when you're in this position, you still have an underlying left AIC pattern. So if you can bring that left hamstring down and do a couple of other things, which we'll talk about later on in the process, then you can sort of, in essence, do both at the same time.
Connor, I have another question. So I came from DNS perspective, and there I think that we are trying to get a neutral pelvic position with the abdominal muscles, and we are trying to not involve a lot the hamstrings, for example, at least when we are trying to get the sagittal stabilization. That's what I receive. So what's the difference with PRI and DNS in the hamstrings involvement when you are trying to use the hamstring to orient the pelvis?
Honestly, I've never taken a DNS course, so I have absolutely no idea what DNS's argument is for not using the hamstrings, but I'd be very interested to know why. Do you know what their argument is for not using the hamstrings?
Well, it seems that we need to use the transverse abdominis and the quadratus lumborum, erectus spinalis, and the diaphragm and pelvic floor together to stabilize the center of your body. And when you have this stabilized position, then you can start to involve the distal musculature, like hamstrings, for example, or the rectus femoris, etc.
I can see that. I can see there being a case for that. I think that makes sense. So ultimately, I think you can get people in a neutral pelvic position by just getting them to expand their rib cage in the proper positions and being able to hold that, which I think is along the same lines of what DNS is saying. I just find the hamstrings are like, I get it. And I think that's like kind of their model, which totally, I think based off of what you said, makes sense. But ultimately, I find the hamstrings are just so useful in so many cases. There are instances where we would not want to use the hamstrings. Like for example, someone that's got like concentrically oriented hamstrings, and maybe it's like pulling them into some sort of awkward sway back position and like they're narrow or something like that, then that's a case where I probably not go for the hamstrings. But for someone who's got, you know, anteriorly tilted pelvis, wide, you know, like those people, pretty much all.
Okay. It would be not recommended, for example, in a narrow in the first layer of compensation.
So yeah, it's hard to make that call. It's hard to make that call.
Okay.
I think for a narrow, I probably am going to be, I can say it this way. For a narrow, I'm going to be less concerned about the hamstrings if they have a primary layer of compensation, but I'm not going to throw them out entirely. But for a wide, I'm going to probably be thinking about the hamstrings earlier because that's going to help them restore hip extension.
Okay, and another question, and it comes more focused on the feet position. For example, if you have someone which subtalar articulation comes in inversion when it contacts the ground, you suppose that this articulation is in a mid-stance position, stack or not?
So you're saying they're pronating or supinating when they
pronating?
So they're overpronating when they hit the ground. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
In that instance, they're probably in a mid or late stance foot. And in that instance, we would want to do a lot of heels elevated things, which would help bias them towards a negative tibia angle, which would also help them reaccess those external rotation mechanics. So I would do a lot of things to help them find their heels, maybe even some hamstrings to go along with that.
Okay. We have shared some pictures of a foot with an inverted forefoot and a everted back foot.
Where'd that chat go? All right. Let's hang on. Let me pull this up really quick. So, and these are your feet?
Yeah, mine.
Nice. This will be a good case study. Okay, I've got it now. All right, this is what we got. Back foot. Should probably start with the front view. All right, this is what we got. So, all right, I'm going to shut up. What do you guys think? Does anyone have any
myself?
Thoughts? Yeah, you tell me. What do you think? What do you see with your feet right there? What becomes apparent? Yeah, you guys can type it in the chat, whatever you want. Pronation on the right side. Yeah. I think the most immediate thing that comes to my head is that his left toe gap is significantly more than his right, and his right side is turned out. We see this all the time. We see this right tibial, this right foot turning out, usually due to a right tibial external rotation. Just start looking for it. You're never going to unsee it for the rest of your life. It's so common. I think it's fascinating, but it goes down to that pattern that we're all in. Anyone else have any comments? Let's look at the back.
Wait a minute, and I share the back. Okay, but I have the back of my entire body.
What do you guys think? To me, it looks like your right heel is wider than your left. The left side is more supported, which throws me off with this AIC pattern stuff. Yeah. All right, we got another one. All right, so his right side is turning out. You do see a right heel that is a little bit more wide than the left, if you guys can tell there. So that is an indication to me right off the bat that he is bearing more weight on his right side, just because it's flatter, right? Now let's go back to the front. So on the left, we got a toe gap, and I would be really curious to see your individual arches, you know, like from a side view, just looking at your arch and only your arch. That would be really beneficial. In fact, is there any way you could set up your camera so we could do that right now?
Yeah, okay, wait a minute.
Sure. Yeah, we'll talk through this while you do that.
I'm issues, so.
What do you guys see within his tibias? He looks pronated, but with high arches. Yeah, he looks narrow. I'd say he's the narrow ISA. So he was probably starting in more of a heel strike position, which explains why his left toe is really kind of spread out. And his right, I think, was there too at one point, but he's ER'd that tibia. Anything else? Left shoulder higher than right for sure.
Sorry, Connor, you just said the ER, the right tibia there.
Mm-hmm.
Explain, sorry.
So when the tibia ERs, it brings the foot out with it like that. You see what's going on with his right foot now. It's more turned out than his left.
Yeah.
That's usually what you see, a lot of right tibia ER.
Yeah.
And
Actually,
then,
yeah, go on.
No, go ahead, Rich.
I was going to say, well, one of the questions I had was that what do you use as your point of reference to identify for the femur and the tibia being externally rotated or internally rotated? So this is probably a good example of how to look at it.
So do you guys see the proximal tibial insert? Can you guys see my mouse, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So his tibial insertion is over here, right? And then you see more so over here on the left. You guys see that? And how the one on the right is more lateral than the one on his left? That's the point of reference I'm using. Now for his femur, I'm going to use this right here. I'm going to use this right here. So I think his right side is in, we saw a knee valgus comment right there. Yeah. So I think we have that a little bit more on the right than the left, because knee valgus is generally right, or femoral IR, tibial ER, because they're going against each other. And on the left, you appear to be a little bit more straight. So yes, possible left hip hike, but this is all visual stuff. I think looking at the feet and the tibia and the femur are like fantastic assessments, but we'd want to know what his actual assessment is, just objectively. So I think once we get a look at his actual arches, that'll tell us a lot as well.
Okay. I don't know if you can see it well. Wait.
I'm gonna have to switch my own view to speaker view. Okay, now put one foot in front of the other.
Like this, one foot in front of the other.
Yeah. Yep, so that's your right arch. I can kind of see that. Looks like you have a pretty good arch, pretty high arch on that right side. Let's see your left.
Can you see this bony, like that it's a little bit more higher?
I think so. I think so. Yeah.
But that's the feet that if you look it from the backwards, it comes inside. It's like I prone here, but I supinate here.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know why.
Let's see your other foot.
Okay.
Oh, that's so hard to tell. Do you guys think he's more or less pronated on the right or left? I think I'm having a hard time seeing it.
Do you think that it's always going to be a result of the hip, or do you think that it could be something to do with like intrinsic foot strength?
It for sure could be something to do with intrinsic foot strength, no doubt about it. But that's why we're concerned with both a top-down and bottom-up view at the same time, because I don't think you can. I think to think it's only one thing would be, I think it would be a little bit misleading. So I think looking at both what the pelvis is doing and what the foot is doing and everything in between, that gives you the overall best picture. But it could be something intrinsic. And when I know it's something intrinsic is when I clear up all the assessments and he's still got a foot issue. Something that's like, ooh, my foot feels weak. I hear that a lot. My foot literally just feels weak. Then I will give them some like, intrinsic foot strength, like, weighted calf walks, like heel float, split squats, things like that.
Yeah, because I'm thinking if the ankle wants to drop his arch, but then his arch is trying to stay super high, it could be something within the, like maybe even like the forefoot that's problematic, and it's almost like a compensatory pattern. But yeah, I can see how the foot or the toes, even the musculature of the feet, could be doing something to combat what the hip's not doing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Ryan asks, does he have weight on his fifth met or pinky? So I guess that's a question for you.
Okay. This one.
Do you feel your weight there?
We're in the fifth met, in the
Mhm.
5 met. Sorry for my English.
Oh, good.
I don't know. I feel a lot of weight here, and in force platforms, it seems that I don't put a lot of weight on the outside. So it's like I enter on this position, and like in a supinated foot to try to compensate the overpronation, and then I go immediately in the first metatarsal. Like it's like, okay, I enter here and I fall down on the first metatarsal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's because your arches are just so high, you're trying to find a pronation strategy.
Exactly.
I think, yeah, that would make a lot of sense. So I think we've hit a lot of things. So let me just kind of summarize. If you were my client, where my mind would go, I would go, okay, your left shoulder's higher than your right. That immediately tells me you're out of the left AIC, probably. So you probably have a secondary compensation. Look at how your right pec is also bigger than your left pec. The nipple line is going to tell you how much pec musculature that they have. So, and it's also going to be playing into the asymmetry as well, right? But you can tell that the right pec seems more well-developed than the left. So that is another indication that, again, he's out of this general left AIC pattern. Number two, you're going to see the left foot that is straight ahead. And honestly, I couldn't really tell through the video, honestly, the differences between your arches, but I will say that you had high arches on both sides. I think that's just objectively what we saw there. Your left is straight ahead. And I think that you have this sort of heel strike going on within your left, which is interesting, but you're also narrow. So that kind of does make sense. And on the right side, you are in more of a mid-stance position because you do have a little bit of a toe gap and your toes are starting to go outwards, but you still have a higher arch. So I think that could be an indication that you're either in mid-stance or late stance, because you also have the tibial ER. So usually when you see tibial ER and a pronated foot, you're seeing more late stance mechanics, but you have high arch and tibial ER, which is also, that could be your attempt to getting late stance and pushing you back into the left, which would also explain what's going on within your thorax. So I would imagine you probably have a similar orientation to what we were just talking about. I would imagine that you probably are trying to find that right IR, but you can't. So you're doing this. But again, I can't really make that judgment unless I had your full assessment. But that's just visually what I see there.
Okay,
But
just to try to add more information, I was playing handball for a lot of years with my right side using to throw the ball. So maybe this is the rotation that I get over and over and over.
So you are pushing your right side forward a lot. Mm-hmm.
And then the other sport which I practice, it's parkour. And in parkour, we are receiving our jumps with the forefoot. So we are receiving constantly. And maybe this is the way why I develop higher arches, because I need the higher arch to compensate the force absorption. I don't know if this is what happens, but it makes sense, I think.
For sure. And honestly, that rotational thing was a big part of it. You see these people a lot in baseball athletes as well as other rotational athletes, because they're constantly rotating towards one direction. And especially if they're rotating their right forward a lot, this is something that you see. Or their left forward, it just depends on where they're rotating. But yes, I totally could see how that rotation would have an effect on your body. Any other comments on this before we move on? I wanted to hit the study guide as well. And hopefully, this is where I get with this stuff. Like, I don't know how much to go into this deep stuff when we're only in week 2. You know what I mean? So I don't want you guys, if you're going to take anything away from this, just understand what we looked at with the foot here, and that will give you a lot of indication. The extra left pelvic hike stuff, we'll get to that, but just I want you guys to understand the fundamental principles of like where someone should be, and that people can deviate out from a narrow ISA or a wide ISA. Like clearly, he is no longer your primary compensation narrow ISA and left ISA. If you guys get that, that's good. Do we have any other questions before we go into the study guide?
Connor, I had one quick question.
Yes.
A quick question. So when you're doing an assessment of a gait pattern, so say I work in a collegiate setting, so I work with a lot of field of court athletes. I'm curious if you're working with somebody and you're assessing their gait, what are some of the big rocks you're looking for when you're assessing, sprinting? I think, for example, like I've heard a lot of coaches say like, oh, they have poor running mechanics and they need this or they need that. Yet at the same time, they're extremely fast. So, they're obviously great compensators. I'm just curious, what are some of the big rocks you're looking for when you assess a gait pattern?
Yeah. So with walking, what I'm going to look for is the hip hike in particular. I'm going to look at, do they have the transition from lateral border of their heel until toe off? So that's what I'm going to be looking at with the foot. So we can look at these things later on in the case studies week, but when you see people that overpronate, it becomes more apparent. When they slap the ground, it becomes apparent. But overall, what I'm going to be looking for within the foot is that lateral border of the heel to toe off. What I'm going to be looking for up the chain a little bit is within the pelvis. I want to see a degree of rotation to each side as necessary, but I want to see the pelvis moving over the fixed femur on the ground rather than the foot moving separate from the pelvis. And also what I want to see in the trunk is rotation. You see so many people that just walk like this, and there's no actual rotation. This is the biggest tell. And you can always tell with most people that aren't, total penguins, which side they're rotating to more. And that also gives you a pretty good indication. And then your shoulders are also going to tell you, when they do rotate, do they dip one down? Do they dip one up? But that's the thing. Like, I feel like doing a whole thing on gait analysis would be 4 or 5 weeks within itself. So I think, and honestly, like, it's not something I think I'm a master at by any means. So I use my assessments through, which we'll talk about in week 4. I find that stuff usually clears up a ton of the gait stuff. I'll look at their movement, like their gait, when I feel like I need to connect the dots a little bit and it needs to line up with what my assessments tell me. But generally when I look at movement, I'm going to look at like what their actual movement is. Like, for example, if they're a power lifter, I want to see them squat. If they're an athlete, I want to see them sprint. And when it comes to sprinting, it's the same thing. Sprinting is even harder because the question is, at what point am I taking something away from them that's going to make them less successful at what they do? And I'm very hesitant to go there. So I think with sprinting, I'm only going to want to change their form if they're a really poor athlete or, below average athlete. And we know we can only kind of improve from there, if that makes sense. Cool. Amy said, this may be visual, but the VMO on the left seemed a little bit more developed. You do see that left quad, right? That left quad wants to be more developed on the left than the right. You see that quite commonly. So there are underlying, despite, is it Jill? I want to say your name right. Gil?
No, Jill.
Jill, gotcha. Yeah. So with Jill, he has this underlying, you can tell that he started in a left AIC position because he's human, right? And he also has these things that sort of add up, like his, for example, that tibial ER on the right, and also the left quad's more developed. So you see these things, but again, the compensations add up. Okay. Anything else before we get into the study guide? Okie doke, let's do it.
Hey, I'm sorry. I'm going to be that guy who comes in late. I just have one quick question.
Go ahead.
When you're like assessing someone like that, wouldn't you want to ask kind of, what is it that you're struggling with? Like, why would you want to go ahead and change someone's posture if they feel good, they're operating well, and they have no pain?
You wouldn't.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Because you could see all this stuff, but they're like, I don't have any pain, I have no injuries, and I perform well at what I do. Like, why would we go and start changing stuff just to make them anatomically symmetrical? Or, doesn't make sense to me.
It would make no sense. You're exactly right. And that's why studies show that posture is not correlated to pain. Cool. And that's why I would also say that, my counter argument to that is, great, you're looking at their static posture, but how are you looking at how that static posture relates to how the muscular function is being dictated by that skeletal posture, and therefore their movement capabilities are being compromised, if that makes sense. So it's like, if you just look at the posture and you're like, well, that doesn't mean they're in pain. It's got to be like, how does that affect the movement, right? Because, I might tangent sort of, but there's that resting pendulum theory, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea of where your joints are in a neutral position for you is like the middle ground of where your movement is. So maybe if you improved your movement, then your posture would improve because you would be resting in the range of motion that is most center for you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks, man.
Okay. Study guide. Number 1, how does evolution play into our development as asymmetrical human beings? If you guys read any of the articles I linked, there's a little bit of this in there. And I don't really care if you guys go into that much detail, but I'd love to hear your perspectives on this because I think this is really interesting. If you guys read some of the articles, it goes into, go ahead, Amy.
Oh yeah, I just thought it was really interesting how, with the gut and the intestines, how that's more on for the small intestines, how there's more curvature and loops of them on the left side, and how that influence and how the diaphragm influences not just how the movement of the diaphragm influences like digestion in general, but how the gravity of the earth influences the positioning of like the intestinal tract too. So
yeah. The reason I asked this question is because it helps you guys understand that it's hard to make blatant statements, and that's what I think the PR I hate is usually centered around I shouldn't say hate, I should say criticism, is around the idea of it's too dogmatic. You can't say everyone is like this, but you kind of can, because that's why we are the way we are. We have, if you agree that we have a heart on the left side and a liver on the right side, then the argument's kind of over. We're asymmetrical. And that does play into how the body is, the weight's distributed, the brain is distributed differently. So while it's maybe not as extreme as some people, are led to believe through, people talking about PRI all the time, it's there. And it's there through evolution. If you guys looked at the brain stuff and how animals perceive stress more through, they try to protect their right side more. It's fascinating to me. I think it's absolutely amazing. And I think it shows the fact that birds are displaying this behavior, and when they're prey and predators display this behavior in certain ways, it's this is just fundamentally built into species. And that's why that question is there.
Connor,
mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's in the articles, but I remember actually thinking one of your podcasts, not remember with who, but someone mentioned that also because gait is a control fold. We don't want to think about which foot to put first, so that's why it's always the right foot, something that you don't need to think every time you do.
Yes, and that's really Raul, I'm glad you brought that up. And there's a gait book, Human Locomotion, the one I recommend you guys check out. It actually benefits us to be asymmetrical because before we walk, we have this unconscious, I wonder if I can go find it. I don't know if I want to spend the time going and finding it, but what happens is, for example, we shift our weight subconsciously over to one side, back to the other, and then we take a step forward with the other foot. So it's kind of like this weird here, forward. And it's funny, in that book, they show the left side taking a step forward first because, that's the side that is more forward than the right. I think that might've been just, happenstance, but I think it's kind of cool. And that happens totally unconsciously before we start walking. So it benefits us to have one side that is biased towards propulsion more than the other. Watch NFL players, watch MMA fighters. They oftentimes have their left side ahead of their right before they start running while they're fighting and things like that. Okay, number 2, make sure you know all the associated joint actions for each phase of gait. I try not to give like memorization stuff because that's kind of boring, but I would like it if you guys did know what was happening at each of these things during each phase of gait. So you guys want to go over that really quick? Who wants to take heel strike? What's happening at the sacrum during heel strike? This is very important to know.
Nutation.
Nutation to which side? So let's say I'm stepping forward with my left leg.
Well, we mutated.
It's going to be in a relative degree. Yes. And then how is that going to affect the femur?
External rotation.
And then the tibia?
Same.
And then the ankle?
Well, going for pronation.
The ankle will be in more.
Sorry, supination.
And then the big toe is going to be doing what?
It's, I can't remember for the big toe.
It's going to be spreading out more.
Yes.
Mid stance, what is happening?
Someone else.
Sorry, Connor, it's not the opposite. It's not counter nutation in the heel strike.
Yeah, it's counter nutation,
Sorry.
but it's nutating to the right.
Okay.
What's happening in mid stance?
Sacrum is nutated. Pelvis is in internal rotation. Femur is in internal rotation, but external rotation relative to the tibia. Tibia in internal rotation. Ankle is pronated, and the big toe is moving towards the second toe.
Exactly. And let's do late stance. It's really easy. It's real similar to.
Isn't it the same as heel strike?
What's the difference?
A big toe extension.
Yeah, the big toe would not be. The big toe would be in a different position. It'd be curling inwards towards the second toe more. And obviously, it's happening in a different resupination coming from pronation, and that pronation cues that resupination, which is going to cue like that pronation. And I kind of touched on it within the windlass mechanism. So that stretches out, that cues the resupination. So that supination technically would cue everything going from up the chain into the pelvis and thorax.
I know this is kind of what we did in week 1, but can you just show me the nutation, counter nutation of the sacrum? I'm still a little bit confused about what that looks like.
I'm sure there are plenty of people that are as well. So nutation, innominates rotate posteriorly relative to the sacrum coming forward, which means this is going to be oriented into internal rotation, adduction, extension when the sacrum comes forward.
That, not the femur, not the femur.
This, but the femur would follow it, right?
Okay.
When this happens, counter nutation, extension of the sacrum, you're going to have external rotation, adduction, and flexion within the innominate bones, but it's relative to this sacrum bone. And then the femurs follow it out into ER.
Okay.
I'm sure someone else had that question too. So thank you for asking.
So I can think of it as nutation is closing, counter nutation seems like it's opening, like if it's a door kind of.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
I can get down with that.
I have a quick question. Is it okay if I ask it?
Please, yes.
The windlass mechanism, is that similar to like before you jump, like the load and then springing, or is it not work on, does it work on different principles?
I think you can look at it as like, let's say you're going to do a bilateral vertical jump. So if I'm going to do that, I'm going to take off in that position. Yeah, I'm going to have to pronate a little bit more, and then I do spring up. That's why there's the difference between a counter movement and non-counter movement jump can be sort of thought of that way. A non-counter movement jump would be going down, like holding that position for 3 seconds and respringing. But then you can't take advantage of the pronation to supination spring. You can't take advantage of the stretch shortening cycle. But in essence, yes, if you did do a counter movement jump, like you went down and up and it was very springy, then you would be taking advantage of that. But also you got to think, well, if you're going to do repeated jumps, you're going to sprint, then that's going to be, you're not really going to access that quite as much, but you are going to still access that, because when we walk, this allows for that big amount of pronation to occur, which allows for the respring. When we're doing something that's high velocity, like sprinting, you're still going to strike more midfoot. So you are going to pronate. That's why you see sprinters have such pronated feet, is because they're trying to quickly go into pronation, allow for that spring to occur so that they can access the stretch shortening cycle and increase their velocity, stride length, whatever.
And for when it's like, it's spelled WINDLASS, windlass.
Windlass. I think I say windlass a lot, but it's windlass. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh man, we have 2 minutes left. I'm sorry, guys. Let's quickly rattle these off. What phases of gait are the left and right side bias towards in the left AIC pattern? I like to say right is more heel strike to early mid stance, left is more tonal. What role does the left and right pelvis take on in terms of respiration biases in the left AIC? I think we already hit that. Why are references for foot and skeletal positions important for making long-term changes? Ooh, this is an important one. Does anyone want to take that really quickly? Why do we care about the foot when we're doing some sort of positioning exercise?
Connor, can you come back to the last question, the second part, where you ask about what's the difference in a left AIC, in a wide or a narrow?
Yeah, so narrow, left AIC, wide, left AIC. Remember, that's the starting point, but you can be wherever after that. It's just, that's there no matter where you are. And why are references important? So I'll tackle this. So we care about references for the foot. If you guys saw my post on Instagram yesterday about the shin angle, that's really important. So for example, let's say we're trying to give someone a left hamstring. We want that left hamstring to be associated with heel strike, because when we strike the ground with our heel, we want to have that neurological association happening. When we strike the ground with our heel, we want that hamstring to start to work to help pull us into the left side. That's the association we're trying to make. That's why we care about foot references when we're doing something like a 90-90 hip lift, a hook line bridge, things like that, or even just within, an exercise. Let's say we're doing a rear foot elevated split squat with the same side load. What are we trying to do? Get them to sense that big toe to help them push off, which is going to allow them to, in the bottom position, pronate and then push off, get that concentric external rotation activity to occur. So that's a lot of words for just saying the foot cues a lot of the movement because it's interacting with the ground, and we want to make that neurological reference. What do you think might be an ideal way to progress the 3 exercises from the slides this week? I mean, that's kind of an open-ended question. We can skip that one for now. Because I will literally show you guys how to do it later. If you're training a runner, when would you potentially consider training heel strike, early stance mechanics? Ooh. I kind of want one of you guys to answer that if you could. So if you got a runner, when would you be like, all right, we need to actually give you some heel strike stuff, even though that's not what you do in your sport?
When they're trying to slow down?
In what sense?
Sorry. I don't know, like braking, like if they need to, if you're playing, is this specifically to a runner? Because I was going to say, if you're talking about deaccelerating and accelerating again.
Yeah, I mean, I can see what you're saying with that. But what about like, you got a cross country runner or a distance runner or something like that, and you're saying, okay, we need to give you some heel strike now.
So, someone who might be dealing with a lot of tension on the calf because of the plantar flexion and maybe problems in the Achilles or something like that.
For sure. Yeah. So they're too far into toe off or mid stance or whatever.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So I work with a lot of track and field athletes, and I would consider it for restoration, for recovery, because there are really a lot on the big toe and on the forefoot. So that big toe, I see a lot of them having the toe come in, touching the toe on their either right side or left side, depending on which foot. So I would do it for learning them to get on the heel, because there are a lot on the forefoot.
Brilliantly said, Fleming.
Yeah.
Spot on. Okay. People tend to prefer to jump off their left leg and load their right leg. What could be going on here if you saw someone doing the inverse of both? We kind of already touched on this. I don't expect you to know this yet, just brainstorm. So just to wrap it up, because I got to bounce out of the client call. So you could have one of these orientations, or you could have someone that, for example, when they were younger, they were coached for whatever reason to do the inverse. You know what I mean? Like you see this a lot with people where, for example, I'm a great example of this. I was really bad. My dad wanted me to be a good golfer, and I was really shitty at golf. I was really bad at it. So he's like, okay, I'm just going to put a left-handed club in this kid's hand and see what happens. And I started hitting it like 5 yards further because like, I don't know what I'm doing. So I just became a left-handed golfer. And then that is what, that actually changed, my neurology a little bit, so I could shift into my left side a little bit easier. And I didn't actually want to be in my right side that much. There's all these different implications and influences that can happen. But generally, when you see someone that can't, get into their right side, you're going to see an orientation of their pelvis where they try to get into their right side. All right. I hope that was helpful, guys. We got into some deep stuff there, but if you're feeling confused, if you're feeling like there's a lot going on, I would just encourage you to take a deep breath, go back to the original 2 presentations. If you know those and those make sense, if you understand the study guide, you're in a good spot. All right, I'll see you next Monday. Thank you for coming.